For coming, Dr.
Okay.
Kiernan. I really appreciate taking time out of your schedule. We'll start with some easy questions first and build up the suspense, and we'll go from there. Okay, Dr. Kiernan, when and where were you born?
In Hoboken, New Jersey, in 1936,
Okay.
Easter Sunday.
Okay, can you tell me about your parents and your siblings growing up?
Well, unlike most of the people that they talk about at St. Peter's College, both my parents were went to college. In fact, I had a grandfather that went to Stevens. So it comes from a somewhat different background than these sort of first-generation high school people that you talk about. I'd like to, particularly at that time that they talked about. So grew up in Hoboken, fourth generation for that matter in Hoboken. But went to parochial school, St. Peter and Paul's, St. Peter's Prep, and then came here. I've got one brother who pretty much followed the same track. And the family's been in teaching for 3 generations. My grandfather was principal in Hoboken. Both my parents taught in Hoboken. My mother taught Frank Sinatra.
Tell me some more about that. Did you have any Frank Sinatra stories?
No, not that I'd want to film.
Oh, gee. We'll talk to you afterward. So, as your parents as teachers, did they have any lessons or guidance for you growing up in, well, the high school years we'll start with?
Well, it certainly was a help in terms of getting a different perspective and working with courses and this sort of thing. Just my father taught Latin, my mother had taught history. I had an aunt that taught algebra, so had pretty much of a spectrum. I think the only advice my father gave was don't teach in the schools in Hoboken. But no, I think it certainly was a family full of school teachers, and I think this is probably one of the reasons I moved towards teaching.
Can you tell me about your years at St. Peter's Prep? Does anything stand out in your mind from those years?
Oh, probably Father York more than anything else. He was the mad monk, they used to call him.
Yeah.
Taught Latin and Greek. And I can recall in senior year, he was teaching both courses. And I think the final exam, he gave us a passage in Greek to translate into Latin. And that took care of both courses. But
I heard that.
that was certainly the most memorable thing from high school. But of course, you had a fairly good, old-fashioned Jesuit education at that time, and I think that certainly led you into college and into St. Peter's. I really never considered any other college, for that matter. It just was the natural sort of thing to look at as an 8-year career.
You said your brother also followed a similar track. Can you tell me about his St. Peter's experience and how he liked it?
Well, of course, he was always coming along 3 years behind me. I don't know that he enjoyed that so much. He had started off as a math major as well in college and changed over to an English major, although he teaches math and computer science now in North Bergen High School and here too.
Okay, we'll get into the nuts and bolts of it now. Okay, you say you didn't consider attending any other college but St. Peter's. What did you hope to accomplish once you enrolled at St. Peter's?
Well, I started off with a rather strange combination because it was an AB math degree. I was the only one at the time. I was thinking of going into high school teaching, and it eventually evolved into college teaching. I don't know exactly when or why that occurred, but it was just one of these things that you just kept on going at the end of college here. I went on for a master's degree. I suppose Angelo D'Ancino was one of the ones that pushed in that direction because he was in charge of the graduate scholarship program at the time. And of course he was coming along following up on Reg Stanton with his Rhodes Scholarship and John Benson with his Fulbright, so he was sort of pushing people in that direction. And he was a great one. He had me apply for a Fulbright. Actually got one, but didn't take it, to the University of Zurich. didn't speak a word of German at the time. I had studied French. But he said, oh, if you could pick it up over the summer. Sure. But he was like that.
We'll get back to your graduate school later in the interview. But you say you were familiar with St. Peter's before you attended school there. Can you give me some of your first impressions of the campus and surrounding area?
Well, of course, the campus was very different at the time. You still had the old wooden buildings across the street that were the Jesuit residence. When I came here, McDermott Hall was 4 years old. That was, of the present buildings, that was the only one that was here. You still had the old gym and what they call the arts building, which was a long wooden building that ran down where Deneen and into the Life Center is now. And of course, Gannon was there, and you had classes in there. The library was, no, the library had just moved over into McDermott, but the chapel was still in that building. So, very different campus, much smaller. But I think, let's say, a much more, I don't know whether we'd call it student-oriented, but it was a lot smaller, and you got to meet more people that way, I think. Certainly it isn't a big campus now, but it's a lot bigger than it was then. And whether that has made a difference, I don't know.
I don't know either. So can you tell me about your first day at school? That might be a tough one. And what year was that, by chance?
53. I don't particularly remember details of it. I mean, you started off, I suppose it was the usual testing, interviews, and all of this, just as it is now. You had a lot less choice in terms of what courses you were going to take. And the day you arrived and said, okay, I'm going to be a math major, I'm going for an A.B. degree, that gave you a 4-year schedule of courses to take. And that was it. There weren't electives. You didn't even choose which section you were going to be in. But it was all planned out ahead of time. Made things a lot more administratively convenient. And I think at the same time you got probably a more organized education out of it, because I guess the individual instructors were a lot more able to coordinate with one another, because they knew that everybody in this class was taking the same English section and the same philosophy section and the same theology section. And so you could coordinate things a lot better. And I suppose that carried over and had an effect on courses. It gave you a much more organized approach to things and development. Much more old-fashioned, I think, too, than you would be getting today. But I think it tied together probably a lot better than it does for students today. They tend more to look at things with no connection between one course and another. So even within one discipline. So in that sense, it's very different than it was when I started. But individual remembrances of a first day, no, I don't.
Okay, getting to your coursework, of course required, as you say. What were some of the electives you had during your freshman year that you?
There weren't electives in those days.
Not at all, huh?
Not at all. First year, well, you had theology all 4 years. You had, well, with the A.B. degree, you had 2 years of Latin. You had 2 years of modern languages at the same time, French. There wasn't philosophy in freshman year, but you had sophomore, junior, and senior. There would be philosophy courses as well as the theology courses. And, well, there was history that you got around to, 2 years of English lit, that sort of thing. But a standard program. There weren't electives except in your own major.
Getting to your major, what was your major and what were some of the classes within the curriculum?
The major was really evolving at that time. 53 was really the first year in which the college had departments. It was the first year in which even the faculty had titles, for that matter. It was the first year in which there was officially such a thing as a major. Before that, you simply took a schedule of courses, and maybe there was room for a few courses that you could take, chemistry, in math, and something. But it was the first time, I think it was in response to one of the Middle States evaluations, that you had a formal major set out. And the first year, it was a college algebra in the first term and calculus in the second term. I think they met 5 times a week. And most of the courses did meet 4 or 5 times a week. And second year continued with multivariable calculus, getting a lot further than it does today. And then you had, within the major, 3 or 4 electives each year after that. But at that time, the major was evolving and becoming a very strong program. It was aimed primarily at people going to graduate school. They were moving towards that and getting very good development. They brought in first people with doctorates in mathematics to teach. And that was John Reiner. And at the end of our junior year, he said he was leaving. He went from here to St. Louis because they gave him a salary offer he couldn't turn down. It was $4,000. So gives you an idea of what things were like all over. For that matter, the tuition for a whole year was less than they're charging now for 1 credit. So.
And how much was that? Do you recall?
I seem to recall it was about $300 for the year.
What about other expenses? Do you recall how much, on average, about for a year? Books and stuff.
Well, there might have been a few fees tossed in on the side. Textbooks might have run $3 or $4. No. But that, and of course, in those days, I suppose, compared to what salaries were for the parents and so on, it's not that much different than it is now. So.
That's true. Man, everything's...
You always have to look at it from that point of view. How much were you making at the time?
I tell you, I respect you because calculus, that word just makes me bristle. Oh.
Well, you did have an option. I mean, after all, there were students you could avoid taking the college algebra and the calculus. You could take Greek instead. So that was the alternative. For most of them, one was as much Greek as the other.
I'm glad I didn't go here. No, I'm just kidding. Okay, shifting gears a little bit. Can you tell me about diversity on campus when you were a student? Were there many African Americans, Hispanics, Chinese, Jewish people? Do you recall?
No, there wasn't. I mean, it was a fairly homogeneous group. There were, I think, the only unusual, let's call it, I don't want to be quoted too much on that. There were some Jewish students. But in terms of ethnic minorities, what they would mean by that in those days would probably be Italian and Polish. It was heavily Irish, heavily German, but that was about it. North European white was the population. How deliberate this was. In those days, they drew students almost exclusively from the parochial high schools in the area. And so that was it. And it reflected the Catholic population of the area.
How were the Jewish students treated when they went to St. Peter's? Do you recall any special guidelines for them to make them fit in?
Well, non-Catholics were exempt from the theology courses at the time, as I recall. Otherwise, no, I don't think there was any, certainly among the students, I don't recall that there was any, let's say, if you're looking from that point of view, antagonism or so on. There was from some of the faculty, quite honestly. I can recall one particular instructor that we had in the psychology course, a Jesuit, who said, who completely dismissed all of modern psychology with the statement that Sigmund Freud was Jewish and therefore he was a liar, and that was the end of it. But this, I don't know what you want to say of that comment, but that was somewhat the attitude at the time.
You probably don't want to give me a name on that one, but we won't press you. We won't press you. Okay. I know there weren't any women students when you went to school, but were there any women in the as faculty or staff or that you had interaction with, maybe at dances or social functions or?
Well, let's see. Grace Schutt was in the library. There were no women on the faculty until the early 60s. You did have the women students in the evening session, but otherwise, other than a few secretaries, that was about it. Well, I think this was sort of the general approach. I think that this carried over into the student body, and I think it was an advantage when the college went co-ed, because it gave the students a very different point of view. You were looking, it would be probably the first time that they came into contact with women on a sort of an equal professional basis. I can recall something, having come from St. Peter's Prep and the college, they got to graduate school, was really the first time since grammar school that had women in the same classroom. And I think it was a cultural shock. And I think that that is one of the advantages of having the college co-ed now.
Very good. Let's see here.
Just a quick question. Don't you think it was strange that women were allowed to be librarians and in charge of the halls of knowledge, yet they weren't allowed to go to college at that time?
It wasn't a question of not being allowed to go to college. I think part of the fact that the college was not co-ed is that the rules for Jesuit colleges were a lot stricter. I mean, in those days, if you even wanted to introduce a new major, you had to get permission from the Superior General in Rome. And so that until we went co-ed after they withdrew most of the restrictions, that they had to appeal everything over to Rome. And so it was really when you got a kind of independent board of trustees. It was pretty much the first act of that new board of trustees that we went co-ed. So that I don't know that you could say it was a local decision that the college was not co-ed previous to that. So it's hard to tell.
Okay. Shifting gears a little bit. We'll probably ask you more about that when we get to the faculty section here. Can you tell me how the semesters or academic years were broken down in your student days, as you recall?
Well, of course, I think except that it ran a couple of weeks later from beginning to end. You started late in September. It was entirely semester in those days. The trimester wasn't introduced even in the evening at that time. Final exams, you had about 2 weeks of class and then final exams in January. And then the spring term started generally about the first week of February. And you ran on, final exams were late in June and late in May, and graduation was generally the first weekend in June. So it ran about the same length as now, except the whole thing was shifted a couple of weeks later in the year.
Can you tell me about the average class day for you? When you woke up in the morning until you went to bed at night, how did you function as a student at St. Peter's?
Well, when you were on campus, classes generally would begin at 9 o'clock. It was not unusual to have classes at 2 or 3 in the afternoon. And as I had said already, you didn't have a choice of when the classes were scheduled. This was set. So it was quite standard to have classes running into the afternoon, and it just wasn't something you questioned. There was also a good bit of homework assignments every day, and it was expected that you would be prepared to talk about it the next day in class and that it would be done. A rather strict attendance policy in those days. If you were absent from a class, there was a form that you had to fill out and turn into what's now the Dean of Students' office. And nobody particularly checked up on this until the end of the term, and then the instructor could, if he felt that someone had been excessively absent, he simply reported this to the Dean of Students, and they had a hearing board that you had to defend these excuses. You had to have them there in the first place, and then to justify these to 3 other faculty who didn't have the foggiest idea of who you were. So that sort of thing went on until the early 60s. There's a good story as to how that was gotten rid of, too.
And this would be?
Well, in the early 60s, I was already on the faculty then and had been on a couple of those boards on the other side until one semester the dean sent around to the faculty informing them they had a quota of a number of students who had to have been reported as excessively absent. So even if everybody had come every day, you had to turn in a certain percentage of the class as being excessively absent. And he turned out to be the only dean that's ever been fired, because the president went and simply canceled all of the penalties that had been imposed by these boards. Simply gave up. There was simply, and that was the end of the whole business. They never had them anymore.
Very interesting. I can see why. Can you tell me about any other rules or regulations you had imposed upon you as students at St. Peter's in the 50s?
Well, of course, students, as well as the faculty, had to wear ties and jackets. Seniors had senior gowns, something that Father Gannon had brought over from Cambridge. The faculty wore, not the whole regalia, but academic gowns when they were teaching. They were good raincoats. You had to run from one class to another. It kept you dry. Because they were so coated with chalk, nothing got through it. So they had that. I don't know what else there would be. Of course, you had fairly standard set of religious activities as well. There was, but the only thing that was required was the annual retreat, and they took attendance at that. Things like the, remember the Mass of the Holy Spirit, they had that in St. Aidan's Church. And the first couple of years, I recall, the freshman class was excused from the Mass because otherwise they wouldn't all fit in the church. Because again, everybody came, you had a ticket that you had to hand in, so they took attendance. And, but that was the way things were. And it really wasn't questioned. One thing of interest, my class was the last class that had any kind of a freshman hazing, because it was the sophomores that conducted it. And when my class got to sophomore year, the officers of the class simply refused to do it. And that was the end of it. I think the administration must have been glad to be rid of it too, because they never raised any comment, and that was the end of it. It never happened again.
Can you tell me about the freshman hazing process?
Well, I think it had been pretty much dead because you could almost ignore it at the time. But the idea was, I think, it was part of an orientation program to sort of disconnect you with high school groupings and so on, simply because the college at the time was drawing from so few high schools that very often you were in a class with 10 or 15 people who had been in your same class in high school, and they were trying to break this up. And so this is primarily the thing that was being discouraged. But you go and look at some of the old rules. The freshmen were supposed to carry around cigarettes for the seniors. I suppose that would be, I think, sort of a assisted suicide these days or something. But that was one of the rules.
You have 2 or 3, right?
Yeah.
And you weren't allowed to walk on the school seal, correct?
Right. I still can't bring myself to walk across that thing in McDermott.
That's what Fred Cranwell said.
Yeah.
Do you still have your beanie?
No, it turned pink long ago, and I threw it out. It faded.
Okay. Well, moving along, can you tell me about the student union or the dining hall when you went to school?
There wasn't any student union. There were student activities. I guess when I was a student, very few of them even had any kind of office space or that sort of thing. There may have been one room for everybody. But I suppose the Argosides did have a place to store junk. But otherwise, pretty much there weren't office space as you have it now. The cafeteria was one room just off the gym. That gave you a good combination of odors. But that was about it. You weren't really catering to any students that were around in the evening. It wasn't open in the evening and so on. But since it was a relatively small group of students, but you didn't have a lunch hour either. There wasn't any specified time when everybody was out at 12 o'clock, so it was simply a question of whenever you were free and you wanted to grab something, if they happened to be open, there happened to be anything there that looked edible, that was about it. But there were no organized lunch hours. But of course, at the same time, since you had everybody in one major taking pretty much the same set of courses, the people of that sort who were all English majors or all chemistry majors or something would be more or less in class at the same time and out of class at the same time. And so that kind of developed a grouping. I turned out to be the odd one in view of the fact that I was following the Bachelor of Arts degree when everybody else in a math major would be in a Bachelor of Science degree. And so it did sort of throw the schedule off every so often.
Wow. Can you tell me about the library? Did you utilize it often, and what was it like?
Well, the library at that time was where the registrar and the dean's office was. That was the reading room, and right underneath that in the basement were all the books, including a little locked-off section of books that were on the index. I don't know that you would call it all that adequate. I don't know that it was so much. I can't recall it except possibly for one or two of the philosophy courses of really having to use the library that much. It was pretty much a case in many of the courses at least. Here's the textbook, we're following the textbook, and you don't need any other opinions because these might disagree with the instructor. So it didn't get used the way you would want a library to get used today. To a large extent, there weren't, that I recall, that much in the way of term papers and that sort of thing. But it was there for, I suppose, in other majors. Very possibly it got used extensively in a history major, a literature major. It didn't get used all that much in a mathematics major. I think the discipline isn't that sort of thing. And they were just building up the library holdings in mathematics at the time, because you were pretty much switching from a very old-fashioned approach to mathematics. After all, in '53 it had just been split off from the physics department. And so you were just building towards a library, and there wasn't that much that had been developed in English in the United States at the time. It was a very new thing. And I think it's much to the credit of Bill Cruz that he was developing a department that could lead students on towards graduate study in math, and was encouraging students to go in that direction.
So you feel your major helped you. How did it help you after graduating from St. Peter's, would you say?
It was, in terms of a collection of courses, it was unusually strong for an undergraduate program. And it fit fairly well. It gave you a very good preparation going into graduate school. Probably I had seen a lot more in terms of the newer things that were going on in mathematics than many of the other people who had come from probably bigger name schools. We had one of the few undergraduate courses in topology at the time, a course in real analysis. And this was kind of unusual for the mid-50s. So it was building towards a fairly strong program. And I think this continued on for as long as there were students to support it.
Excellent. Can you tell me, speaking about buildings for a second, one more, the chapel in the bottom of
No, it was
Kiernan?
the chapel was on the first floor of Gannon at the time. That's why there are those curved windows on the side. The chapel had been the back half of the building, or back quarter of the building, and the front part had been the library until they built McDermott.
Does it ring a bell how it looked from the interior? Sorry to press you, but if you don't remember it.
Yes, no, it was a very well-designed chapel. I say quite honestly better than any of the ones we've had since. But it was the only chapel that the college has had that was designed specifically as a student chapel. It moved the chapel when they needed that for a biology lab. It moved into something that had been converted from a chemistry classroom into something that had been converted from a student lounge. And you never really had a room since then, including the present chapel, that had been built as a student chapel, because what you've got now is really designed as the chapel for the Jesuit residents and was not intended for use for students.
Good. Enjoy to take a break. You're doing great so far. Yeah. Okay. Moving on then. Can you tell me about some of your memorable teachers that you had as a student?
Well, certainly very good teachers. Bill Cruz in mathematics and Frank Keating.
Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Well, Bill was a very unusual person. I mean, he did not have a doctorate, but he appreciated the value of the new directions that math was taking at the time, in the 40s and 50s, even though he wasn't that fluent himself with it. And he was willing to go out and hire new people coming out of graduate schools who knew a lot more about mathematics than he did. And I think that's much to his credit. So he was certainly one of the memorable and good teachers I had. And I would put Frank Keating as another very good teacher that I had. He was my senior theology teacher. Was, again, very alone in his department at the time. Had been working on a degree in theology degree in Europe, which unfortunately he never finished. But certainly in terms of looking at modern theology and looking at it from a very liberal point of view, I think he made a long-range impression. I think over the years you came to appreciate what he was trying to do a lot more than maybe you did right at the time. But I think it was simply because he was involved, let's say, in the anti-war movement during the late 60s that gave it any kind of a credence in my mind. Simply that I felt he was honest. And it was that made me look at that movement, even though I didn't agree with him all the time, that said, all right, well, there is something worth looking at in the positions that he was taking. And so I respected his positions. And I think I came over the years more and more to come over to his point of view. But it was a long time getting there.
Very good.
But certainly, I say they were the two best memorable teachers I had. I had a number of others who were, for many reasons, memorable. I had John Dunn for French, Jim Conniff. He was crazy. I mean, things you wouldn't try these days. I had him for a year of the literature course, and you had every day, the course met 5 times a week, and every day you had to memorize about 10 or 15 lines of poetry. And he would call upon anybody to recite not just that night's poetry, but anything from the start of the term, all the way back to September. So you had, hundreds of lines of Milton, you had all sorts of Shakespeare sonnets and whatever, but just, pick up, here's a line, pick up from there. But that was, I think, part of the education in those days, and I think it's something that's lacking because students don't know how to memorize things anymore. And you can force yourself to do it, but it's something that, like any other kind of exercise, if you don't do it all the time, you lose it, and you can't get it back again.
It is true. It is true. I'll ask you more about the 60s and studying. I know my brain capacity is really limited, but how about any memorable Jesuit teachers or administrators you recall from the 50s?
Well, as I said, Frank Keating. Most of the others, well, don't quote me on that because some of them are still around, are something of a blur. You had some eccentric ones, you had some mediocre ones, and you had, as I said, something of a blur. There really isn't any other that I would recall as being a great teacher. Certainly they were good and doing a good job of the courses. But I think the whole curriculum of that time, certainly from a later point of view, was badly dated and was something that should have been modernized and wasn't being. But it was, after all, the whole curriculum was set from outside the college. And I think even what textbook would be used in this sort of thing was not the choice of the instructor. So very possibly many of them wanted to do something different. And I think it was, Frank Keating was one of the few that just simply ignored it and did what he wanted to do.
Rebel.
Mm-hmm.
I'd like to hear about these eccentric ones, but that's
off
okay.
camera.
Okay. Okay, can you tell me about some of your extracurricular activities as a student?
There wasn't all that much going on. There wasn't so much of a math club at the time. I think it was simply the courses were the math club. I was in Argus Eyes, but I was never in a play. I was always in the business end of it. That was about the only activity. Of course, you had 2 years of compulsory ROTC at the time. The only time I was ever in the St. Patrick's Day Parade was when I was a freshman, right at the tail end of the parade. The only thing behind us with the street sweepers cleaning up from the horses. But by the time we got there, it was a bitterly cold day. Even the cardinal had left by the time we got to St. Patrick's. So.
Can you tell me about what it was like to be in the ROTC and what were some of the procedures that?
It was a kind of a standard. I don't think in the first 2 years, and what you had there were as professional as it became later on. It was a kind of mechanical sort of thing, I think. You just marched up, marched down. You were in the armory or out in Lincoln Park, depending on whether it was snowing or not. But it was, I think it was in the 3rd and 4th year. I didn't continue in it. but it was in the third and fourth year that it probably became a lot more professional. That in the first 2 years they were looking at it from a point of view of, well, this is something you have to do for everybody and you just keep them entertained. I don't think there was much in the way of an intellectual content to it. You learned how to take apart an M1 rifle and this sort of thing. You had this sergeant who I don't think knew anything else but how to take apart and put together an M1 rifle. Beyond that, I don't know that he could write his own name. But that was about the level of it at the time. It did get to be a better organization later on.
You mentioned Argus Eyes. Can you tell me something about Mr. Roy Irving and your association with the group?
Yes. Well, because, as I said, I was never in a play, so I was never working with him as a director. But he certainly was a character. And very good, very, very professional. And I think he was very concerned about developing a professional approach from the people he was working with, and did an excellent job of directing the plays, of choosing good plays that were appropriate and casting them well, and I think taking a real personal concern with the people he was working with. He was just a good person to know.
Excellent. Okay, school spirit. Do you recall any displays of school spirit, or how strong was it? What was the mood on campus for old St. Peter's, as it were? You can sing the Alma Mater if you'd like.
No, I still have, I've even got an old 78 record of it, if you want that for the archives. The original version of it. I don't think anybody even has a score of that. But
excuse me, I'm drooling here.
Well, you can have that because I don't have a phonograph to play it anymore. So.
I'll find one.
Okay. So, but you did have, I think there was a much greater turnout for things like Glee Club concerts, and I can recall the 25th anniversary of the Glee Club. They had it out in what was then the Mosque Theatre Symphony, the old Symphony Hall in Newark. And we filled the place because the whole orchestra, and they were up into the balcony. And that place is close to the size of Radio City Music Hall. So that was where they had their 25th anniversary concert. That would have been in, I think, '56. But you would fill the auditorium for an Argus Eyes play, and there was a good turnout for it, and I think a good many students came out for it because, well, of course, the college was a lot smaller then, and so everybody would know somebody in the play and this sort of thing, know someone in the Glee Club if they weren't in it themselves. And so you had a much smaller group of students. I think at the same time there was a much bigger split between the arts and science school and the business school, because they almost never came in contact with one another. And so that very possibly you had one group that never met the other, and so on. There were even different colored class cards and different colored bills, and even at that time, if you were a member of the faculty and teaching some courses in the arts school and some courses in the business school, your salary came out of two different budgets, so that there was no contact administratively, student-wise, or anything between the two schools. But other than that, I think it was mostly the arts and science school that carried those organizations. There were separate organizations for the business school in both day and evening. So, as I said, a smaller college, and I think that by itself brought about a closer camaraderie and a different kind of spirit than you would find today, or even would be possible today.
How about athletics? That probably also led itself to a lot of school participation and.
Yes, that too. I think it was about probably basketball was about the only major activity they had. Others came and went. But of a major activity on a varsity level, I really can't think of anything that would be continuing, depending on who happened to be around. They might have had a golf team one year or a tennis team or something like that. But the only continuing thing there was basketball.
Very good. We'll move down here. We'll try to. Okay, can you tell me about some of your friends or interesting characters that you can go on record with from your school days?
Well, of course, it was a very small math major at the time. I think there were 6 that graduated, math majors at the time, which was the largest group of math majors that they had had, I think, up to that point. I guess I was the only one, I think, went directly into graduate school. A couple of others had eventually gone on for master's degrees. I was the only one that went into teaching or was even planning to go into teaching, either high school or college. I think the others all pretty much went into business. We did have even something of a tragedy right after it, because one of the math majors who was in the Marine Corps Reserve, was a veteran at the time, just the 2 days after graduation, he was taking his final flight in the Marine Air Corps and crashed. So he died 2 days after graduation. But that was something of a shock. It isn't the sort of thing that you expect right away. So that when you get into the 3rd and 4th years, of course, you're kind of isolated, other than in the philosophy and theology courses, which are the only courses you were taking at the time, with people from other majors. And even there, they were pretty much grouped. I think everyone else in the classes were pre-med. And they were going off in a very different direction, and you didn't get to meet with them because they had their own little package that they followed, other than philosophy and theology. So that you sort of built little groups depending on a major. And so unless you knew people from an activity or something of that sort, from a small major you knew very few people. From a large major you probably knew a lot of people.
Exactly. Okay, you mentioned freshman year and some things from sophomore, junior, and senior, but I'll ask you again, any other highlights, lowlights from sophomore year that you'd like to tell us about?
Well, not especially. I think, as I said, kind of in my own position, following both the Bachelor of Arts degree and a science major, you kind of lost contact with each of these groups as you went along. So you knew a lot of people, because the groupings were not only by major, but they were also by average. And so that, the A students were literally A students in section A, and the B students were in section B and down the line. And then so that you had homogeneous grouping very much in the class, and it gave you a very different kind of competition in terms of the philosophy and theology, and earlier in the literature courses and so on. And so I was largely in a class with a group of students that had come, well, I think I had the whole contingent from Regis in the class, and a good many from Xavier and Brooklyn Prep as well. So it was a fairly strong, but most of them were going towards arts majors, history, literature, that sort of thing. That's where most of them wound up.
How about your senior year and commencement day? What stand out in your...
It rained. We were out in Roosevelt Stadium. Everybody was out on the field and the whole thing, and then it started pouring rain. So the whole graduation ceremony moved inside. We were under the stands. The only one that had a seat was the Archbishop. Everybody else was standing. The dean was up on top of a overturned garbage can, trying to be heard, reading out names and all the announcements. But that was graduation. Nothing you could even take a picture of. I do have a picture of the empty stage with puddles all over it. But that was graduation. My diploma, of course, in those days you had the big rolled up sheepskin. And of course, with the Bachelor of Arts degrees, it was right on top, the first ones that handled out. So it just has a whole run of rain marks down the side of the diploma. Well, of course, it was rolled up, so at least it didn't blur the print.
That's awful.
But it was memorable. Can mean many things.
That's true.
I can't even remember who gave the speech, but I remember the rain.
Symbolism. Okay, we'll move down here. What was the best advice or guidance you did receive as a student coming out of St. Peter's?
Well, certainly in terms of what graduate school to choose, how to make, I think, and it carried over into how to make decisions in the long run. It came from Bill Cruz. He said, well, for whatever reason, make up your mind. And once you've decided then that, don't regret it. Don't go start worrying about, well, what if? And could things have been better? And anything of this sort. I think that was very good advice. I don't think he pushed me towards a particular graduate school because I had several offers. I had originally chosen Notre Dame. I'd accepted them, and then the offer from Brown came along, and I took that and didn't regret it. Because I think I got my master's degree there, didn't finish the doctorate there. I finished at NYU. All of the decisions that I made on that basis, I would say in retrospect, the alternatives would not have been as good. So I think that was some very good advice.
Believe it or not, my great uncle founded Brown, but I'm not smart enough to get into it. But that's awesome. Can you tell me about some of your Brown experiences and NYU and at NYU that stand out?
Well, of course, two of them were very different. I was full-time at Brown and part-time commuting at NYU. Very different schools. Brown, of course, both undergraduate and graduate were at least what they called co-ed in those days. Brown had a separate women's college, but they took classes together. I think it was a very different, very small department, unusual for a graduate school that had a very good graduate reputation. Brown then, I don't know that it still does, but then had a reputation that they were primarily concerned with their undergraduate courses. And so that it wasn't a case that they simply turned over the undergraduate courses to their teaching assistants and this sort of thing. They had small classes on the undergraduate as well as the graduate level. Probably their classes weren't any bigger than what we have here at St. Peter's. And they were being taught by all the way up to their full professors, teaching undergraduate courses, which is unheard of in most graduate schools then or now. So you got I think, a good perspective in terms of concern for undergraduate courses. On whatever level you are performing, whatever level of research you're concerned with, you should be concerned with the undergraduate courses. After all, they're paying most of the bills, for one thing. So you get a good perspective there. First-year graduate students were not allowed to teach or to be TAs. You had a straight scholarship. And you were doing nothing but taking courses. That's what you were there for. In the second year, they would let you teach courses. You were teaching them on your own. You were running the class. But at the same time, you had one of the the full-time faculty members as a mentor who would occasionally sit in on the course and give you advice. They were grouped into sections. But it was also a good perspective when I came to St. Peter's in terms of, you were coming from an Ivy League school and great students and so on, and then you come here. And this really wasn't true. I don't think that the students that were at Brown were all that better prepared than the students that we had at St. Peter's. They didn't have any better ideas. They were better able to express the ideas, either verbally, either orally, or in writing. But I don't think academically they were all that much better at that time. So that I think that was something that it gave you a good insight when you came to teach at St. Peter's, that you saw what things were like, and they really weren't, the Ivy League schools weren't all that great in a sense. The students, as I said, were perhaps more fluent, but academically they weren't all that much better prepared. And I think I myself, coming from St. Peter's, had at least as good, in terms of course content, preparation, as people coming from, there was a student from Oberlin, one from Tufts, Franklin and Marshall. And I think my background was as good as theirs.
Very good. We're done. One more student question. You could just keep going, giving every name. He says St. Peter's is better than Seton Hall, but no, we won't. We won't press you on that. Okay, last question from the student one. From a student perspective, how valuable was the St. Peter's experience for you, in general, and any specific examples you'd like to give?
Well, I think certainly one thing that was true then and is true now in terms of the education that's available is that you've got this strong liberal arts core curriculum, that it's not just a major. And I think this is a great advantage that you had then and that's available now if the students take advantage of it. I think we have perhaps lost something in the great variety of electives that you have now, that it's not all as well sequentially organized, that you don't get a chance, let's say in a sequence of 4 philosophy courses or 4 theology courses, of developing a logical structure and getting it across to the students and having it sink in as something that is naturally in the discipline, and that you can, that you should approach a discipline from an organized perspective. Possibly we've lost something of that sort. And this was something that wasn't so much pointed out to you when I was a student, as it was simply there. It was a natural part of the education process. And so it simply almost subconsciously became part of the way you learn and then the way you teach. And I'm not quite sure it's there anymore. It's unfortunate, but that was certainly one of the great advantages that we had when I was a student.
Very good. Okay, we'll segue right into the faculty, but first we will, I'll give you a name of a president that you may have had relations with or worked with. Can you just give me some reflections on each one? Father Vincent Hart? He might be before.
I would really have had no contact with him. I don't recall if he was the president when I started or not. Because you see, right at the beginning at that time, the prep and the college were still one community. And so that, except for having to sign diplomas and that sort of thing, the president wasn't all that much identified up here because he was the rector down in the prep as well. And so he'd be spending as much time. So Father Hart, I probably had more experience with him, whether I ever even met him or not, I don't know. But down at the prep, I don't recall him particularly at the college at all.
Oh, Father James Shanahan.
Yes, he was the president at least most of the time that I was a student, and also in the first year that I was on the faculty. A very quiet individual. I think sort of an old style of president, not the kind of person who would function very well as a president these days. Perhaps very good as a president then. One unusual thing about him, he refused to take any kind of federal money for anything. And so you didn't have, didn't even have an NSF grant going on at the time. None of this federal money available for buildings or anything of this sort. He just didn't want any kind of federal entanglement whatsoever. Of course, there were legal complications at the time that I think they just hadn't thought through and just didn't want to become involved with. Except that he's the one that fired that dean. I don't really get an impression of him as sort of a quite, in a good sense, lackadaisical kind of approach to things, is the impression I would have of him.
Wow, I heard Father Shanahan never fired anybody. Fred Cranwell said Tom Cessna, he was divorced, right? But he said Father Shanahan was so nice he didn't even fire him.
Well, he did. I don't recall if it was he or Father Clark did fire a faculty member right in the middle of the year.
Ooh.
Because he went off and got divorced. Well, he went off to Reno with his secretary and married her without telling his wife about it, is what happened. I hear this end of the story. It never really got around campus, but I hear it because the wife and my mother went to the same hairdresser. So that's how I heard about the story.
I suppose it's mute to ask for a name, but interesting. Okay, we'll move along. Father Edward Clark.
Yeah. Again, an old-style president. I think he was the last president of the college who didn't have a doctorate. Again, the impression I would have of him would be, not a great intellectual. Would be not interested in expanding the college. See, I have to think of him in comparison to what almost immediately followed him with Leo Mclaughlin, who was the vice president and acting president a couple of times when Father Clark was sick, and a very different personality and a different point of view towards education. Father Clark's degree was in education. And although he would be willing to have individual departments develop new programs and so on, it was not one for, I'd say, going off strongly in some directions and taking the leadership in going off in those directions. So that both Father Shanahan and Father Clark were more or less sort of letting things move along without making waves, either one direction or the other.
Okay.
And then you come to Leo Mclaughlin. Well, of course, many things changed rather abruptly when he took over. And I think at the same time, it was very good for the college that he went very quickly to Fordham. Because what he did with, Ben Salem College at Fordham and bankrupted the place was what he was planning to do with all of St. Peter's if he had stayed here. And we wouldn't be here if he had stayed, because he had the bright idea that he was going to turn this place into a first-class graduate school. And it wouldn't have worked. But after all, the whole country, all the Jesuit provinces got together to bail out Fordham. They wouldn't have done that for St. Peter's.
Wow. This is illuminating. Wow.
But at the same time, he did get the college moving intellectually. His degree was from Paris, and he was pushing for research. He was pushing for doctorates on the faculty. He was the first one that had, at the convocations and the graduations, have the Jesuits wear their academic outfits to show off their degrees. That really bragging about the fact that you had, among the Jesuit community, too, people with degrees from Europe, people from prestigious schools in the United States. So I think he gave a very different intellectual flavor to the college. But as I said, he had much greater plans than I think could practically have been brought about. But he did develop a very different spirit on campus. Got students involved in at least presenting ideas to the administration and being involved in at least knowing what was going on and having some participation in academic affairs. Having I think it was he who at least started the move towards a faculty senate, having elected faculty on committees and so on. So that the whole change to what we might call the new St. Peter's would have come from Leo Mclaughlin.
Okay, the famous Father Vic.
Yeah. He was a very good choice for the college at the start of his administration. I think he was the one that held the place together in the late 60s, that even though you did have students out picketing, I mean, he was out walking with them and talking. So that I think he was the one that certainly kept the place calm. And I don't know how he managed it. He managed to say yes to everybody on both sides of the argument, and everybody stayed happy. But he was just that kind of a character. Eventually, it got to the stage where you can't run a college that way. And so, but certainly that we survived the whole period of the late 60s and early 70s was due to him. He was just the right person to have at that time.
Do you have any Father Vic stories in particular? Anything that...
Not particularly. I mean, I wasn't working individually with him that closely. I think I had the advantage of working with people who were working with him and profited by this, but not so much directly with him.
Okay, how about Father Glenn?
Well, I was on the budget committee for part of his administration, as well as late in Father Anatelli's administration. So I got to see a very different perspective, I think a lot of which still has to be confidential, but you did get a perspective of how Father Anatelli administered the college, how Father Glynn administered the college, how Father Degnan administered the college, and very different people and how you have to shift gears to live with each of them and perhaps to almost translate each one of them into what the faculty senate, for example, would be looking for, and how to serve as a go-between with each of them. So I had that kind of a perspective too, because I was an officer of the faculty senate very briefly under Father Yanatelli, was on that college council for a couple of years. That crazy idea. When Father Yanatelli had the bright idea that there were three sort of equal people running the college: the president of the college, the president of the faculty senate, and the president of the student senate. And so that went along until he came up with the idea that he had this college council that was a deliberative body and that he was bound by their decisions until the Board of Trustees told him, the hell you are. You're running the place and you're responsible for it. And so actually the college council sort of committed suicide by rejecting its own constitution. So that was the end of the council. And very luckily, I think, for the college. And I was an officer of the Senate under Father Glynn and all the way through Father Degnan's term. And so you had a different kind of contact with them than perhaps most faculty would have, and a very different perspective on how they ran the place and why they ran it the way they did.
Okay, Father Degnan.
I think we got along very well, quite unusual. If you knew how to approach him, you could work with him very well. And I think there was an art to it. I think I discovered it by accident almost the first day he was here. And so we just got along very well.
How did you approach Father Degnan? His temper was legendary.
I think if you pretty much stood up to him and told him that some idea that he had was crazy and gave him a good reason for it, he would listen to it. I think if he discovered that you were afraid of him, he would walk all over you. But if you addressed him with some reasonable counter-arguments, I think he was willing to listen to this and perhaps see the sense of it. So I think that was the way you needed to approach him.
Okay, we'll put you on the spot. Last one, Father Logren.
I still have to deal with him.
Okay. Good answer, actually. Would you like to take a break, or how you doing?
If you want, yeah.
Oh, we're fine. How you doing, Robert?
Yeah. Okay.
Good. Like I said, there's fewer questions on the faculty point of view, but we'll start with the specific events that you touched upon. The Strike of '69. Do you have any commentary on that one?
Well, of course, I saw it from a lot of points of view. And I think at the time, and I still do, I thought that while there may have been some justifiable complaints, I think that most of the troubles were caused by a few people in the faculty who were taking advantage of justifiable complaints and manipulating them to their own advantage. It came after a rather major revision of the core curriculum. It was in the mid-'60s that you went down from a requirement of, let's say, 12 credits in English, 24 credits in philosophy, down to 6 credits in English, 6 plus maybe 6 in philosophy, 16 credits in theology down to 6, and so on. And so this had rather strong cutbacks in the faculty. And I think in a couple of cases, perhaps it wasn't handled well. Perhaps the people who were chosen to be eliminated, and of course, I mean, you had to face the fact somebody had to be dropped. And, well, maybe I might agree with dropping the ones who were dropped. It wasn't handled well. I think Edmund Ryan was not that sensitive to handling things well, and so he was part of the problem. But other people who were, well according to the rules and for good reasons being terminated, tried to tie their case into these others. And what happened, of course, was the ones where it was handled rather abruptly, after a good bit of give and take and so on, Father Anatelli did back down and kept them on for the lengths of the contracts, and so did things properly. But the others, they were the ones who were sort of stirring up the problems and trying to say that, well, my problem is the same as yours, when it really wasn't. And it was kind of difficult keeping track of what was going on, and I think the whole thing got rather obscured. And many of the students who were involved in it were possibly involved because they really didn't know what was really happening. And they were being given a bad perspective of what was going on. There were some legitimate problems, but I think most of the people who were out on strike for one reason or another were there for possibly because they didn't really know what was going on and the whole picture of what was going on. And it was being deliberately obscured.
You also mentioned a student protest during the 60s, 70s. Do any specific reasons or events, individual pickets that you recall in your recollections?
Well, this sort of thing. I mean, they did one time, a whole bunch of students decided they were going to sit in Father Ryan's office, the academic dean at the time. And, well, he was not handling things very well. He just simply called up the Jersey City Police. And I recall there was one student, she was a math major, she was one of the more active students at the time. She was sitting in there, and her then boyfriend, whom she eventually married and divorced, rather conservative fellow, he went in to either persuade her to leave or drag her out, and wound up getting arrested himself. So there are these sort of side stories that I think maybe are the things that ought to be preserved.
Oh, yeah.
But I didn't at the time have much sympathy with what was going on, particularly because you could see the sides of it. And then, of course, it was Julius Rosenthal, a rather famous member of the faculty in mathematics. He was the moderator of SDS. One of the more conservative, when he, well, not in everything, but I think in much of his philosophy he was. And, but he turned out to be the moderator of SDS, but rather strange character. He taught for us for 2 years, and then decided right at the end of the year, after signing up a contract for next year, he was going to go off to Africa for 2 years to teach. And so, well, I said, go ahead. And he wanted me to take care of his marijuana plant while he was away and have it out on the fire escape outside the math department office. But no, that didn't come off. But we had some strange characters at the time.
Why not?
That's what makes life interesting, I think.
Yes, most definitely. Okay, well, we'll get to the faculty questions here. Okay, when did you start teaching at the school?
In '59. I'd been 2 years at Brown, and then came back here and was going on for the doctorate at NYU.
Okay, why did you choose to teach at St. Peter's?
Well, of course, I had liked it as an undergraduate. I felt comfortable there, and there was a position available, and so I took it. I had applied to it, applied here, and a couple of other places. I had interviewed at least one other at Iona, and I think the whole approach up there didn't strike me as professional. I think the chair of the department was one of the brothers up there. I think one thing had forgotten the interview and was off taking a nap or something or other, and the switchboard operator had to get him up out of bed to conduct this interview. And I think he started off the interview by offering me the job without even talking about anything. And I just felt it wasn't very professional. So by comparison, I liked it here and stayed.
I'll have to send a copy of this up to the Christian brothers. Okay, what were what you hope to accomplish once you started as a teacher rather than a student at St. Peter's? How did your focus change?
Well, of course, at that time, the department was, I think, primarily interested in preparing students for graduate school, or else for going into professional areas, primarily the insurance area or something of this sort. We were just starting to build up contacts with Bell Labs. Frank Verricchio, who was in the department, had a summer position at Bell, and so was able to get positions. And so we've got any number of our alumni who are fairly high up in Bell and AT&T or various of the split-offs from there. So we had a very good connection there. And so these students had a very strong preparation. It was early in the 60s that we got one of these very primitive computers. And so the students that we had weren't just learning fancy languages and how to write programs, but they knew how to take this thing apart and knew exactly where to kick it when it didn't work. And you were working there on punch paper tape. You weren't even up to IBM cards when they started here. And so these people really learned the trade from the bottom up. And I think that this was very good preparation for them and great advantage. And so you had this, you had a department that was on the forefront of what was going on in the field, both from the 50s when I was a student and well into the 60s. So I think it was a good place to be.
Excellent. Hey Robert, how are we doing on tape? You want to check it out? Yeah. Okay. Hold on a second. Doing good so far, Dr. Kiernan.
Yeah.
Don't worry, we only have about 200 more questions.
Okay.
No, it's not that bad. It's not bad. I'm cutting a lot of them out.
Yeah.
Make yourself comfortable. So that's the computer, huh? Wow.
Yeah.
From the ground up.
Mm-hmm.
Just after UNIVAC.
Well, this was
second generation.
This was an LGP 30, which is about a contemporary of UNIVAC.
Wow.
But this was vacuum tubes. So you're still back in there. And the students had to, if you wanted to store data, you had to, first of all, the whole program had to be written in hexadecimal code. You had to write the entire thing in machine language.
Yes.
And you even, every time you put any item of data in, you even had to tell the computer in what place to store it. And if you wanted to call up some information, you had to tell, well, exactly where you stored it and where you were going to move it to, and where, if you're going to add two numbers, where they were and where you were going to put the sum, and the whole works. And you certainly learned computers.
Unbelievable, unbelievable. Okay, I guess we're looking good, and I'll quote you when we're at that time. Okay, can you tell me about some of the earliest subjects or class titles you taught?
Well, I taught, the first course in the major that I was teaching was group theory, which has been absorbed into the modern algebra course now. I taught topology, which unfortunately we don't give anymore. But these were fun courses. And of course, in those days, sometimes you had sections, 3 sections of a junior or senior level elective. We had that many majors. There was one year we had, I think, something like 53 math majors. And so you had them split up. This group was going towards graduate school, and this group might have been going towards industry, and this group might have been going towards high school teaching, and you could gear the electives for that. You had 2 terms of many of these courses. You got well into materials, and I was able to present material in the courses that were things that were being covered in the graduate courses that I was taking at the same time, and we had students that could handle that. I wouldn't want to try it now, unfortunately, but the students today, however good they may be by comparison, don't have the kind of background where they can absorb that material.
What are some of the later classes you've taught, and what are you doing right now in terms of teaching?
Well, of course, I suppose through the 60s, in the late 60s, we had a grant from the National Science Foundation called a COSIP grant. And we were running seminars that were effectively a 5th year of the major. It supported the students and the faculty to do their 4th year of the major during the summer and then do these seminars. We brought in a faculty member from another college to team teach with one of our people for the graduate program. We brought in somebody from Bell Labs to do the business version. We brought in a faculty member from Dickinson High School to do the program for the high school teachers. So we were running 3 of these seminars, and it ran very well. And shortly after that, well, for one thing, you had the computer science major introduced, which took away a good many of our majors, so that people who were officially math majors declined rather abruptly at that point. And at the same time, you had, in the mid-70s, this rather serious change in the high school population, that they weren't getting as good preparation coming out of high school. The simple demographics, there weren't that many students in the high schools, and so the admission standards started going down. And so what you were doing was perforce dropping courses off the top, introducing the developmental program, because we started developmental math courses in the mid-70s and been just accumulating more and more of them over the years. But that is the change in the major. It has moved downward, unfortunately. It's the same sort of thing that's happening in other colleges, because I can recall a friend who was then the chair at Jersey City State, and we were commenting, it was mid-October or so on, and just made the comment to him in a conversation that well, we're just about getting to linear equations in our developmental course, and he said that he was just about getting to multiplication. in his. So, the grass isn't always greener somewhere else.
Yeah, I can't really remember linear equations, but okay. Speaking of students, can you tell me about some of your memorable students throughout the years? Which have stood out in your mind?
Well, the first year I was here, one very good student, he was, see, in those days you only had one major, you didn't have double majors. But nevertheless, he was taking courses all over the place. And so when he finally was up for graduation, he had to decide whether he was going to be a math major, a chemistry major, or an English major, because he had fulfilled all the requirements of all of them. And so you had this math major who was also editor of the Pavan, decided to be a math major. He went on, got his doctorate at Berkeley. While he was at Berkeley, he did take a year off to go up in the Maine woods and write poetry. But this is the kind of student you like. I recall every so often we correspond back and forth, and he visited, at least while his family was still here, but he teaches now out in one of the schools of the University of California. But one year I recall I had met Tom Banshoff, who was he had given a presentation up at Brown. I'd gone up there as an alumnus, one of these summer projects, and then we invited him down. Here, it turns out, not only had Frank Rush taught him as an undergraduate at Notre Dame, but then when Tom went out to California for his degree, he was in the same class with Frank Flanagan, this student of ours at Berkeley. And so he and Frank were great friends out there in California. He said that one of the things that Frank Flanagan was into was he was selling Oriental carpets on top of all the rest of the things he was doing out there. And he said he remembered driving up the Pacific Coast Highway with Frank in a Volkswagen Beetle with a couple of Oriental carpets tied on the roof. Now that's the two of them. But this is a memorable student. Certainly he is the most memorable. I think anybody else would have to pale in comparison. But there are any number of good ones that we've got. Students who have gone on to teach at other universities that are CEOs of companies now, any number of people in Bell Labs that have been in the computer business right from the start. So all sorts of good connections for the college, and we've taken advantage of it. Because I can see a lot of this, because one of the things I'm supposed to be doing is keeping the alumni records. We've got a newsletter we mail out each year. And so I've got a whole list of all our alumni and all sorts of data on them. Sometimes it's better than what the alumni has.
Very good, very good. Okay, well, we might as well get to it. The faculty, the college committee first. Can you tell me about your years with the college committee and...
the faculty senate, you mean, or the college council?
Thank you, college council. We'll get to the faculty in a minute.
The college council was one of these crazy things. They've got a set of minutes which are the worst things imaginable. I mean, when you can record that a motion was passed unanimously with 2 abstentions or 2 negative votes. I don't know what you mean by unanimously, but that's what's in the minutes. They would often say, well, we passed this document and the document isn't quoted anywhere. So, and that's the way it was run. It was one of these things that it was haphazard. Nobody really knew what it was supposed to be doing, but it met all day Saturdays 3 or 4 times a year. And but nobody was really sure what function it had, and I don't think Father Yanatelli had any idea either what it was supposed to be doing. So it was a big waste of time when you come right down to it.
Okay, the faculty senate. Tell me about your involvement with it and some of the highlights.
Well, of course, I've been here longer than the faculty senate has, so I've seen it right from the beginning. It has been a very good voice of faculty opinion. It, I think, has done a lot of very good things for the faculty and for the college in terms of curriculum development, in terms of faculty welfare, just general administration of the college. I think it's been up and down, but I think in the long run a very good force for the college.
You do great minutes, I have to say. Excellent minutes. Okay, we talked about diversity when you were a student. Can you tell me about diversity as a teacher? African Americans, Hispanics, women? The great
Well,
melting pot.
it came about, I think, very slowly. You had, I suppose, the first group that you would consider that would be labeled diversity today is when you had a large influx of Cuban refugees in the early 60s. They were fleeing Castro. And what you had there was students who were coming from professional families. And so you had a very strong educational background. And so this group wasn't noticeably different, in a sense, from the the group that had been at St. Peter's before. You had a strong appreciation of education, and so it wasn't in any sense an us and them situation that you would tend to think of when you go around labeling people as minorities. It was only, I suppose, into the 70s when you started getting a very different demographic distribution in our source population. When the number of local students available in the high schools locally, because we weren't thinking in terms of boarding students in those days. And so you were still drawing primarily from Hudson County, the metropolitan area. You were suffering from the problem that New York State scholarships were not exportable while New Jersey ones are, which had a very serious impact because we were drawing heavily from New York high schools at that time. We drew a large contingent from Brooklyn Prep while it was still in existence, because it was easier to get to St. Peter's from Brooklyn than it was to get to Fordham. So we lost a large population source there. Very honestly, the college went co-ed. One of the main reasons was because you had this whole group of good students that we weren't drawing from. And so initially, and they admitted it, the admission standards for women were higher than they were for men. And this very slowly tapered off. They were afraid, I think, because they didn't know what was going to happen when the college went co-ed, because you had all of these horror stories that were accumulating from other places that had gone co-ed, that once you allow the number of women students to go beyond 40%, you'll suddenly find it's around 70%. And they didn't want that. I think the real problem was that when the college went co-ed, they really didn't know what they were getting into. That one of the crazy things at the time, you go and read some of the documents at the time, was trying to get a comparable set of rules for the dress code. The male students still had to wear jackets and ties. And of course, here you've got these poor Jesuits trying to write the female equivalent of that. And they didn't even know names for things, much less what to say. So that it caused trouble. I recall when we had the first women faculty members in mathematics. We had a Jesuit, it was Bob Canavan, as the chair at the department. And at that time, we had 2 apartments over in 121 Glenwood, where we still are. And he went so far as to take the 2 apartments, each one, of course, they were converted apartments, they each have a bathroom, and he labeled one for men and one for women. This is, I think, part of the problem in those days, that both the faculty, particularly the Jesuit faculty, were so inexperienced with women that you didn't know what to do, and they didn't know how to get into this. And so it was very timorous at the time. But it worked out very well. And certainly, despite the complaints of that great, what did they call it? The Committee of 1,000 against going co-ed, that actually consisted of 7 students. It worked out very well, and I think it was greatly beneficial for the college. And it was just about the right time to do it. But by the time you got into the late 70s, the college simply wasn't able to maintain the old entrance standards and at the same time maintain the population size that they needed to balance the books. And so very slowly you started lowering admission standards. That was all they could do. And so it was at this, you accommodated this by going into developmental courses. I think mathematics did it without any, it wasn't a college-wide program at the time. It was simply something we did within the department. And even as early as late as the mid-'80s, we were hiring a faculty member who had been teaching at Fordham. And when the question was coming up as to, well, what does Fordham do about developmental students or students who aren't prepared? And the answer was nothing. You simply went into the standard core and you either survived or you didn't. That they didn't have a developmental program. But lots of other places, I recall from the alumni bulletin at Brown, that they were instituting a developmental program. And they defined developmental students as anyone whose college board scores added up to, I think, less than 1,200. Now, at a time, we were lucky to get anybody whose college board scores came to 1,200. But below that was their definition of developmental. So, but St. Peter's has done a great deal, has moved a great deal in that direction. And I think they had a number of very good programs. And if they maintain a personal contact with them, then they can accomplish a lot with those programs. The standard developmental program, well, you look in comparison to something like the EOF program, where all through 4 years you maintain a strong contact with these students, and you've got a very good success rate there. And this is something that more needs to be done for these students. But certainly the math department and the college in general has done a lot of good work, and I think a lot earlier and a lot better than many other colleges have done. So I think either moving in the upward direction or, unfortunately, moving in the downward direction in terms of a curriculum and meeting the needs of students. St. Peter's has always been sort of ahead of things.
1,200, holy cow. Can you tell me about a typical day in life of you as a professor and your usual classwork for a semester? How does your schedule work out usually?
Well, I'm thankfully at the point where I'm just teaching 4 courses. I don't need overload anymore. And I'm at the stage where I just couldn't handle overload. That's all right for young people. or people who have the motivation that you really need the money. But I've gotten to the point where I don't have either motivation of that sort. So I'm teaching 4 courses and a variety of them. Unlike many other people, I like doing 4 different courses. I'm putting in that pitch because the president wants to move in a different direction. But I like it. I think mathematics is a different situation than it might be in some other fields. Perhaps in some of the humanities, you can easily handle several sections of the same course because you don't have to do exactly the same thing in each of the sections of a course, whereas in mathematics you have to. And you have to keep these sections together. And that gets kind of hectic when you've got a schedule that one of them meets on Monday, Tuesday, and Thursday, and the other meets Tuesday, Thursday, and Friday, and sometimes one meets before the other and sometimes after the other. And then along comes this holiday that one of them has and the other one doesn't, and so they're out of sync. And it's not something you can say, well, we'll catch up to that in November. So I like teaching 4 different courses. And they're usually on different levels. So I would have, in mathematics, we always like to have at least one course where you're teaching something on the junior and senior level, one of the specialized courses just to keep your sanity. And then you have a cross-section of core courses, perhaps developmental courses, depending on the individual.
Good. Can you tell me, have you been a moderator or faculty advisor for any student organizations?
The only one I was ever involved with on that basis was the math club that we had back in the 60s that evolved into the Math Honor Society that we have on campus now. So I was the moderator of that math club. It had started off, actually it was the students that started it. It was simply a problem session for my course, my junior, senior level course. So the students were getting together, trying to do the problems, and this evolved into a math club. And so it got officially organized. And then eventually we put in for a charter for the National Society when Dr. Poyani arrived, because she had been involved with the society when she was at Douglas. And so she was involved with putting in the petition for the charter. It's a very strong honorary society because the admission requirements and the forms and so on are almost the same as the data that you need to put in for Phi Beta Kappa. And the requirements of the faculty in terms of how many have doctorates and so on are very comparable.
Very good. How are we doing on Dave, bro?
You've got 10 minutes left.
Okay. Can we change over? Well, we're pretty much near the end, but we might run over. Okay. I'll ask one more and then we can do it. Thanks, Robert. Okay. Publications. Have you been published, and what are some of the titles of your works?
Actually, not very much. I had published one article that was the basis of a talk that I'd given actually when the Pi Mu Epsilon Society was set up here. I'd given the initial lecture, and that evolved into a publication. It was something that came out of the math course that I was teaching at the time. And then my doctoral thesis, which was actually in the history of mathematics. And I'd published that. And in fact, at that time, since we had a great number of electives, we actually had a course here in the history of mathematics that wasn't just all talking about the Greeks, but actually was a history of 19th, 20th century mathematics. And so that went over very well until the supply of students ran out. But I've been more involved in committee work and that sort of thing. So that there's any number of things that developed out of courses that probably were publishable, but you just don't get around to these things because at the time we were teaching so many extra courses and doing things that you just don't get to things like that. And unfortunately, when you didn't have to, you just didn't do it.
Wow. I knew you had a bit of history in you. That's a good thing.
Now, for some strange reason, I enjoy history.
Good.
So I've been working on history of other things as well as history of mathematics. And
Excellent.
I've developed